Good morning, dear students. Welcome to your Google Classroom. Today I am here to do portions from the second semester. You remember the text that was prescribed for you last year for the second semester? Appreciating poetry. And so, regarding the text, we have to complete some of the poems in the collection. And now university has announced the semester exams, the external exam for the second semester, even though we haven't got the timetable. And so we will complete all the poems that are left incomplete in the last semester. And so I will be posting these video lectures in the afternoon session. Because from 8:30 to 1:30 you have the usual classes. And so what is left out in the second semester we will be doing in the afternoon session. But remember, you have the university examinations for the second semester. It is already announced by the controller of examinations that you have the second semester examination, even though you haven't yet got the detailed timetable. And so whatever is left unfinished from my portion and from Miss Darley's portion, we too were doing appreciating poetry. We will do them one by one. And so go through the lectures, study it, prepare well for the exams that will be scheduled soon. Okay. And so the first one that I will be doing is Ode to a Skylark. That is, we will begin with P.B Shelley, P.B Shelley. I have already given you an introduction to Shelley, and again I have just started with the poem. But even then, I am sure that you may have forgotten everything. We have just started it. But I will begin right from the beginning, including the poet. I will introduce the poet first and then the poem. And so now it is the poetry class. Keep your text open. So that when I read from the text, you will be able to follow the lines. Okay. And so we will begin with Shelley, P.B Shelley, P.B Shelley. And so that is, who is Shelley? He is a romantic poet. Shelley is remembered as a romantic poet. His lifespan is from 1792 to 1822. And so that is, he was born in 1792. And you know that romantic period started with the publication of lyrical ballads in 1798. And the lyrical ballads is a combined work by William Wordsworth and Samuel Taylor Coleridge. It marked the beginning of Romanticism in literature. And Lord Byron, John Keats, Shelley, etc., they belong to the second generation Romantic poets. Okay, and so who initiated the movement? Wordsworth and Coleridge. And P.B Shelley, then John Keats, you have already studied, and then Lord Byron. They all belong to the second generation Romantic poets. And remember, what was the need of Romanticism? Romanticism emerged as a reaction against the rationalism of the 18th century. And so Romanticism started as a reaction to rationalism of the 18th century. That is to be more clear. To the earlier poets, reason was the highest faculty of man. But to the romanticists, imagination is the highest faculty. The point is that, for example, classical poetry is called the poetry of the head. They pertain to the intellect of the person. While romantic poetry is called the poetry of the heart, and it is the poetry of emotions. And the poems of the romantic period are highly imaginative. And in this context, you should remember the definition of a poet given by Wordsworth in his preface to the lyrical ballads. I told you that lyrical ballads is a combined work, a collection of poems by Wordsworth and Coleridge together. It was published in 1798. 1798 has become a very important date in English literature. It marked the beginning of a new era. It marked the beginning of a new period in English literature. And again I told you that the poems of the romantic period, it focuses on the imagination. Remember, before this text, that is lyrical ballads, Wordsworth wrote a preface. Preface is called introduction. What is preface? Introduction. He wrote a preface to the lyrical ballads. And the preface is very lengthy and it expresses Wordsworth's views on poetry. And since Shelley also is a romantic poet, the points are very much applicable here also. And Wordsworth says that poet is a man speaking to men. Poet is one who has a greater degree of sensitivity and sensibility. Understood? And he also says that poetry is the spontaneous overflow of powerful feelings recollected in tranquility. Understood? And so Wordsworth stresses the importance of imagination. Understood? He says that poets are different from ordinary people in that they are highly imaginative, they are highly sensitive, they are highly sensible. See, whatever goes through our mind, in the mind of the poet, it attains greater dimensions. Understood? The poet's mind is like a big receptacle, a vessel holding all feelings, emotions, pain, sorrows, joys, everything. That is Wordsworth's theory on poetry. And so you understood that how much important is imagination for a romantic poet. And again, romantic poetry. See, I'm giving you only a very brief introduction. And so, romantic poetry, you understood what caused the beginning of the romantic period. And then you have understood the lyrical ballads, which was authored by Coleridge and Wordsworth. And then you understood that P.B Shelley, then Lord Byron and John Keats, they belong to the second generation of romantic poets. And for them, for the 18th century poets, if reason and intellect were important, for the romantics, imagination is of primary importance. And then Romanticism drew inspiration from the French Revolution. It refused to accept authority blindly and upheld individuality. That is, classical poets dealt only with great themes, some stock themes only about the great people like king, emperor, soldiers, etc. But for the romantic poets, all are equally important. If the classical writers wrote only about the rose flower and the lotus, The Romantics wrote even about the silly grass and the daffodils. And that is why Wordsworth says that even the meanest flower can arouse volumes of poetry in me. And so they gave importance to the individual. And then the writers wanted freedom from all the old traditions and conventions. Our Romantics loved nature. They had a great fascination for nature. And their important slogan is return to nature, back to nature. Our Wordsworth says that our nature is my friend, teacher, philosopher, everything. For all the Romantic poets, they gave great importance to nature. And they strongly believed that a return to nature will be the proper solution for the ills of this world. Why we have many problems? We are moving away from nature. And so what is the solution to our problems? A return to nature, back to nature. That is the slogan of the Romantic poets. And so you should understand that for Shelley also, nature is all the more important. Objects of nature are all the more important. Then again, Shelley, among the Romantic writers, the most revolutionary poet is Shelley. Actually, he was fascinated by Gothic romances. He liked to question the authorities. He questioned the church, he questioned the king. And when he was a student at the University of Oxford, he wrote a very provocative pamphlet in which he had said, "The mind cannot believe in the existence of God." Okay, you have understood that Shelley is the most revolutionary among the Romantic poets. He had written a very famous poem called Ode to the West Wind. There also the revolutionary spirit of Shelley is well revealed. He was very bold, ready even to question the king and even the church. And when he was a student at the University of Oxford, he wrote a very provocative pamphlet in which he said, "The mind cannot believe in the existence of God." And for that he was expelled from the college. And he married Mary. She is the daughter of William Godwin, who wrote Political Justice, advocating political radicalism. Just understand that Shelley was the most revolutionary among the Romantic poets, and he had a blind admiration for nature, and he married a woman called Mary, and she was the daughter of the famous William Godwin. And then about some of the works of Shelley. See, Shelley had written a very important critical work. It is called A Defense of Poetry. And here he says that poets are the unacknowledged legislators of mankind. Understood? Shelley knows very well the role of a poet in the society. And so he had written a critical work called A Defense of Poetry. And there he proclaims that poets are the unacknowledged legislators, lawmakers of the mankind. And Shelley considers a poet as a missionary, as a prophet, and as a leader. Understood? And so this is the viewpoint of Shelley, which he had made it very clear in his critical work called A Defense of Poetry. And here he compares a poet to a prophet. A poet can foresee things like that. A poet also can foresee things. Then he is a missionary dedicated for the welfare of the world, and he is a true leader of the people. And then some of his odes. Ode to the West Wind, I have already mentioned. Then To the Cloud, then To a Skylark, Spirit of Delight. All these are very important poems by Shelley. See, I am giving you the names of some of the odes. See, you are going to study Ode to a Skylark. And he had written another very powerful ode called Ode to the West Wind. Ode to the West Wind, the last line of the poem is very important. The poet concludes the poem like this: if winter comes, can spring be far behind? Okay, that is, whatever problems you have, definitely a bright day is awaiting you. Even after a very stormy night, daybreak is awaiting you, isn't it? Life is a mixture of joys and sorrows. Life is a mixture of fortunes and misfortunes, and we have to accept it with an open mind. Because if winter comes, definitely spring will follow the winter season. And so even after a very dark night, you will be having a bright sunshine day. And so such hopeful poems were written by Shelley. Then The Spirit of Delight is another one. And he had written 2 lyrical dramas. One is Prometheus Unbound. Prometheus Unbound actually is written in the same year when he wrote Ode to a Skylark. And then Hellas. And so, which are the lyrical dramas written by Shelley? Prometheus Unbound and Hellas. And then Adonis is his elegy on the death of John Keats. Understood? See, he had written an elegy when his close friend John Keats, another very famous romantic poet who died at a very young age of 26. And when Keats died an untimely death, Shelley wrote an elegy lamenting the death of his great friend, and that is called Adonis. And Shelley died in a boat accident. And so he also died very young. He died in a boat accident. Understood? That much regarding P.B. Shelley. Percy B. Shelley. Understood? His lifespan is from 1792 to 1822. And then I told you that Romanticism started with the publication of lyrical ballads in 1798. And the lyrical ballads is a combined work by Wordsworth and Coleridge. And so Wordsworth and Coleridge were called the first generation romantic poets. And Lord Byron, John Keats, P.B. Shelley, etc., they were called the second generation romantic poets. And for the romantic poets, the greatest highlight is that they gave primary importance to emotions and imagination. For the classical writers, they gave importance to reason, to intellect. That is why classical poetry is called the poetry of the head. And regarding the romantic poetry, they gave importance to imagination. And romantic poetry is called the poetry of the heart. Our heart is the seat of all passions. And so romantic poetry deals with emotions. And then you have understood that Shelley is the most revolutionary among the romantic poets. And then he was very bold even to question the king and even the church. And he married a girl by name Mary. And then his views on poet is contained in his critical work called A Defense of Poetry, where he declares that a poet is a missionary, a prophet and a leader. And he had written many important odes like Ode to the West Wind, Ode to the Cloud, Ode to a Skylark, The Spirit of Delight, and so on. And he had written 2 lyrical dramas, Prometheus Unbound and Hellas. And then he had written an elegy on the untimely death of his friend John Keats, and it is called Adonis. And Shelley died in a boat accident in 1822. And so that is regarding the poet. Understood? And see, and now the poem under consideration is Ode to a Skylark. Remember, it is one of the best odes written by Shelley. And what is an ode? Ode is an addressive poem, isn't it? I have already explained to you what is an ode. Ode is a poem addressing a person, place, or thing. And so this particular poem is an ode because it addresses a skylark. And it is based on a real life incident. He was prompted to write this poem when he listened to the song of a skylark. And actually, John Keats had written an ode to a nightingale, and Shelley ode to a skylark. These poems have lot of similarity, and both of them were written by highly talented writers, and both of them have a great place in English literature.